Hello everybody and welcome to what is almost certainly going to be a very long Patreon video. So, thanks for your support and everything, but right now you can support me by shutting up because we got a lot of work to get through. In this video, I'm going to tell you about my personal campaigns for the games I reviewed in the first 3 episodes of Quinn's Quest, namely the Wildsea, Lancer, and Heart. I'm going to tell you what I was thinking and what was getting me excited as I was planning my stories. I'm going to tell you about how I prepped, and I'm going to tell you about what worked and what didn't. Basically a whole bag of tips. You can pretty much think of this video as like an addendum to those reviews. A practical addendum for a practical person. Also, you guys get to giggle in astonishment at my notes. Check this out, this is like my favorite thing I've got since I started Quinn's Quest. This is all the paperwork of all the games that I've been running in the last couple of years. My notes, character sheets, little printouts of the books. I love the RPGs let me get excited about stationery. It's like an accordion of dreams. So first up, Wildsea. Holy crap, this is so thick because of all the art I printed out from the book that I could hand my players. So, one of the exciting things about Wildsea is the unfettered freedom that it offers players, right? Players can go anywhere, they might encounter anything, they can do anything for a living. Might sound like it's quite tricky to prep for. Au contraire, I'm going to tell you now why Wildsea was such a dream for me to prep for. So as huge as the world of Wildsea is, it's entirely divisible into ports, like the settlements that players can visit, and the sea between the ports, right? So yes, in the long term, my players could go anywhere in this world, but on a session-to-session basis, it took them from arriving in a town to leaving that town maybe about 2 to 3 hours of play as they did R&R, had scenes with each other, collected ideas for new adventures, and generally got into trouble. And then the journeys between towns would take minimum 1 hour or maximum 2 hours. But what that meant is because the towns took a big chunk of time and the journeys took a big chunk of time, it was almost impossible for my players to have more than 1 town and 1 journey in a session. So I only ever had to prep a town and a journey. And so yeah, in my campaign of Wildsea, it felt like the forest was positively thrashing with life and NPCs and possibility at all times, but I only ever had to prep 2 little things. It's a big cheat. So let's start by talking about those journeys, the actual sea of Wildsea. The way that Wildsea works is that when you're out on the sea, you roll a dice to see if you have an encounter that's either related to peace, order, like civilization, or nature, and then you roll a dice to see how bad it is, 1 being a disaster, 6 being fine. So look, here's what I did. I essentially went shopping through the Wildsea core book to pick a bunch of ideas that I thought my players would have fun with, and then used it to populate a list of encounters of all 3 types, with at the top being good and at the bottom being bad. And then I had some extra stuff on here for fun weather conditions. And then whenever my players rolled the dice to mean they had an encounter, I drew a line through it. And then every couple of sessions, I would repopulate this list and print it out again. And the towns were also pretty easy because all of the towns, as written in the Wildsea book, are pretty colorful. This is a town of weird cultists who worship a leviathan. This is a town of ex-pirates that live in a giant skull who really want you to believe they're not pirates anymore, but they totally are. So that gave me a foundation. And then to populate the settlement itself, I used something called the 7-3-1 technique. I read about this on a blog post by The Gauntlet, and it's just so good. It's almost like half prep and half mental exercise for the GM. So what you do is you create 7 things that players might find in the case of what I'm talking about right now, this town. 7 things. So that might be some NPCs, or a festival, or a shop, or a weird event that occurs to the players. 7 cool little things. And then for each of those things, you write down 3 sensory details, stuff that helps you pop that event or person into 3 dimensions in your brain. And then finally, you give each of those 7 things 1 way that you physically embody it with your body language. Now, not all RPGs demand that I do 7-3-1, but it is such a good tool to have in your toolbox. You'll find that if you do 7-3-1, you don't even really look at your notes. What it really is a structural exercise for the GM that means you do exactly the right quantity of prep. There's a truism in GMing that the correct amount of prep is enough that you're prepared, but not enough so you don't mind throwing it away. That's what 7-3-1 is. So those were my basics. Those were the nuts and bolts of how I prepped, the foundation of the session. You might then naturally ask, okay, Quinns, but that's 1 session of Wildsea. What did you do as your big story arc for the campaign? And the answer, at least at first, is that I didn't. You see, when I started Wildsea, all I cared about was making sure the characters popped, my players felt like they belonged in this world, and the ship was brought to life. I didn't immediately want to set my players on railroads, like session 1, it's the Wildsea, you can go and do anything, but the princess 100 miles away needs rescuing. No, it's not. It's not about that. Disclaimer, some playgroups will want it to be about that, and if that's what they want, great. For me, I started with my players' drives. Every player character in Wildsea has a couple of drives that they write down, things that their character is driven to do. So between my player characters all having their own drives, and them as a group needing to make sure the ship and its crew were paid for, we were away. I had one player character who wanted to eat strange new things, I had another player character who wanted to be loved, and then I just, set them loose on the Wildsea and they got into hijinks and it was great. So that was the first couple of sessions, just as we got our feet wet. And then what I did was, okay, you might have heard the great GMing tip that it's generally always better to bring an old NPC back than it is to introduce a new one. It's great because players immediately feel about the NPC a certain way. They can bring that to scenes. You don't have to bring in an NPC and then make them care some way about them. I felt the same way about designing the overall grand story of my campaign. I thought it was going to be stronger if I could start that big arc by reintroducing something the players brought to me. I thought that would be, just like reintroducing an NPC, a good way for players to be invested and care. I thought that would make the world feel more alive and reactive. And also, I just think it's cool when players can get to the finale of a campaign and think, God, this whole story we went on because I chose to have an argument with that one other captain 16 sessions ago. So the arc that ended up happening in my campaign of Wildsea turned out to be all about libraries. So there is a free adventure for the Wildsea, which I put in front of my players for fun, called The One-Armed Scissor, and it's about the players going to look for this lost library ship and see what's happened to it. And long story short, the players arrive at the library ship and all of the books have been gobbled up by a huge slug that eats words. So my players had this encounter, they killed the slug, they tried to rescue some people, they kind of failed, but then they got back and delivered news of what had happened to this ship to the town, and the town were very grateful. And I thought, hey, here's a fun reward for the players. Because they're kind of into this idea of a library. Their player characters started to be a bit heartbroken at the loss of all the books. I said, okay, this town will equip your ship with a new room, a traveling library. And then I let them recruit a librarian NPC to, to get that ship +1, the ship they all own is getting bigger and cooler. But then my players really liked this. They really got invested in the fact that their ship now included this lending library. So I said, okay. Then I had a conversation with them. I said, first off, do you want this campaign to be political with you staying in one of Wildsea's reaches? Think of them like zones in Sonic the Hedgehog. Do you, as a table, want this campaign to be political and you're going back and forth between the same 4 towns and you can really get to know one location and all the NPCs in it? Or do you want to go on a big exploration adventure where we go through several different reaches? And my players told me, we want to go through different reaches, we want the exploration. I went, great. And then I said, you all like books. How do you feel about going exploring for rare books? And they all said, yes, GM, we want that one, give it to us. And I said, great. And you see how we built the arc together? And that meant I had their buy-in and they cared about it. So then we went through this Act 2, traditionally the dark act in storytelling, where Act 1 is light introductions, Act 2 is the dark night of the soul, and Act 3 is resolution. I took them to Kremik Surge, the reach in Wildsea that is just totally cursed for their second act. All the characters were pushed to their absolute limits as they gathered these rare books. Then in Act 3, they arrived at a theocracy that banned most books. Their ship's very arrival threatened to destabilize it, and so they became enemies of the state. And so our Wildsea campaign ended with them having to topple this fascist, theocratic, book-banning government. It was great. I was able to give them a swan song and a final villain who found the power of books frightening, which was just very apt for the kind of tone of this game, which is equal parts colourful, tiny bit childish, but also very earnest and adult. But of course, you and I are getting distracted talking about stories, because let's not forget the most important thing when GMing a Wildsea campaign, which is the ships, your players' ships, their home. As a GM, I put so much effort into trying to bring the players' ship to life, and you know what? I probably still didn't put in enough effort. And that's because the ship isn't just this cool thing that the players have. It's where 65% of the scenes in the entire campaign take place. There is no upper limit for how beloved and vivid you gotta try and make it. I had my players draw a map of it immediately, but I also had us all think about the chores you have to do every day to keep it running, to keep it clean. I had them think about how you eat, how you sleep, how it smells. Everything I could to make it so beloved and vivid that when I inevitably drove a chainsaw through the hull in one epic battle in Act 2, they all screamed as if I'd driven a shank into their own thigh. Every encounter in this game should be an opportunity to bring the ship to life just a touch more because, like, encounters out at sea don't happen, like, the players aren't all waiting on the deck for the encounter. Someone is doing something. Yes, some monster just found them, but what were they doing before? Were they eating breakfast? Okay, great, let's start that scene with everybody eating breakfast, then the monster attacks. In the dead of night, did paralytic viper vines wrap around the ship? Well, if so, the crew member who finds it will be the one who can't sleep. Okay, you. Why can't you sleep? Who was being annoying that means you can't sleep? And then, of course, you've got the undercrew, the like inferior sailors that the players get to boss around and also design a little bit. And yeah, oh, let me show you what I made for this. This is my undercrew cheat sheet. What we've got here is everybody's name and age. We've got a quote, which I can say to myself to try and like inhabit that personality. We've got their desires. And I gave each NPC on the ship a special scene that I could use as an event if we rolled peace and one of my player characters was particularly interested in or hanging out a lot with that particular NPC. It's kind of like an idea from Stardew Valley, right? You level up your relationship with someone in Elf and then they tell you a secret about themselves. I also really leapt at the chance, like, because there were basically like initially 5 and then later 7, 8, even 9 NPCs that were with the player characters at all times. I used Wildsea as an opportunity for me to try and explore and embrace and like mimic basically my inner Brennan Lee Mulligan, right? I wanted to have all of these different voices and accents and embodiments that I could snap between at a moment's notice, and it was intimidating and hard, but by the end of it, I felt so comfortable doing it, and that was just a really rewarding thing for me to do as a GM. Very pleased with myself, felt very proud. However, one interesting thing that didn't go perfectly in my campaign, like, by the, like, you know, after a few sessions, whenever my players recruited a new NPC to their undercrew, everyone was really interested, they got fleshed out in a lot of detail, everyone really loved them. However, that wasn't true for the 5 undercrew members who'd been with the players the longest. And you know why? This was something my player pointed out to me. Because in session 1, we introduced like 5 undercrew members that were just there already, like, my players never got a chance to interact with them. It wasn't a special recruitment thing. So, what I would encourage you to do if you're running a Wildsea campaign is start the game with just the officers, and then in session 1, have the first adventure be starting to recruit the first members of the undercrew, just so players can have those special introductory scenes with, in the long run, every member of their undercrew one after another. Or, you know, apparently the designer of Wildsea just uses the undercrew like red shirts and just kills them off. That's not me, though. On the subject of like ships and crews, one thing I did that I would strongly think about doing in your campaign if it wouldn't set the cat among the pigeons among your players, I made one of my players in my Wildsea game the captain of the ship. And this was just great. I will probably do a whole other Patreon video on Quinn's Quest about what I think is a really good idea of like changing the power dynamics between your players, make one of them more powerful. That player doesn't have to stay that way, and it doesn't have to be like a really, it doesn't mean they get to be the main character and make all the decisions. It just gives everybody a really interesting relationship towards them. So yeah, in Wildsea, it immediately created this like interesting set of relationships around the table to have one person the captain and then like a very clear hierarchy of all the players. But also, it just made the game feel a lot more nautical. And also, it meant that my players didn't sit around arguing for a long time about what to do because it was always up to the captain. The other players were, however, free to disagree with the captain and become grumpy or even mutinous, which is, I mean, for some players, that's more fun than being the decision maker. So next up, oh, it's hard to put the stuff back in. Lancer. So Lancer is, or at least was when I played it, very obviously a game of 2 halves. You have the cool tactical combat and then like the not tactical combat, the politics, the role playing. I'm gonna cover each of these things one after another, starting with all of my advice for GMing the tactical combat. So I really only have one thing to talk about when it comes to designing the combat of Lancer. Well, okay, 2 things. The first thing is like, goodness me, it's fun as hell designing combat encounters. Speaking as a kid who grew up on like Shining Force and Final Fantasy Tactics and Advance Wars, it's wicked just being able to embrace your own level designer and come up with objectives and enemy designs and narrative frames for battles to make them exciting. But there was one thing about designing the combat in Lancer that was like a continual fly in my cocktail for just the entire game, and it was this: balancing the encounters. So Lancer is modeled after D&D 4th edition, right? In D&D, it's not so bad if a combat encounter is too easy or too hard, because if it's easy, don't worry, there'll be another fight around the corner. If it's too hard, players just run away. I was designing Lancer encounters that were like epic, pitched medieval battles. So if a fight was too easy, that was like just the air being taken out of a combat that might take like 3 hours. And I would have mentioned this in the review if it was like super important, but it's not a massive deal, honestly, because danger and drama mostly exists in the imagination of your players. And also, players like winning. But I don't know, the fights I designed could have just been better. And also, I would have enjoyed them more as a GM because, I mean, I forgot this when I was playing Lancer, but like the GM is a player too, and I should be having fun. And if I'm controlling a number of units that I realize like a quarter of the way to the fight, like, I'm gonna get absolutely creamed, that's just less fun for me. Not least because I guess the whole time I'm doing the fight, all I'm really thinking as I'm moving my troops around is, I fucked it. I should have made this harder. And like, yeah, I could have brought in like, oh, here are some reinforcements or here are some hidden units. But frankly, my players are smart and I think they might have known exactly what I was doing. So there's a couple of solutions here that I think you should do that I did not because I'm an idiot and this would happen every week. And the week after that, I'm like, I won't change what I'm doing at all, but I'm sure it'll be better next time. Readers, it was not better next time. Thing number one you could do, design all of your battles in multiple stages. So like, you know, like here's the initial wave of enemies and like, or like here you have to take this objective now and you have some enemies and then you have like a couple of different options for how hard the next battle could be based on how easy your players find it. So like they take an objective, you're done with the fight and then the enemies counterattack and that's part 2 of the fight. Another thing you could do is quite literally just keep a tally of how many units that you sent at the players and how hard they found it. That's such an easy solution. I didn't do it. Next, let's talk a bit about the roleplay that I GM'd between the fights. So a little something about me as a GM. When I'm role-playing a genre piece, whether it's like swords and sorcery or cowboys or yeah, like big mechs, I'm really interested in connecting to the earth of the genre, the stuff that made the genre exciting in the first place. So like, I don't know, when I think about my favorite fantasy scenes, I think about that scene in the like original Arnold Schwarzenegger Conan, where there are like 20 people riding towards him on horseback, and he is so sure he's gonna die, and he sends up a prayer to his gods, while the Basil Polidaris soundtrack is swooping, and all that really is a person with an axe who thinks they're gonna die. That's the kind of fantasy I wanna run. Like, I'm also moved by how in Princess Mononoke or Lord of the Rings, the weather is made such a character. Of course it is, because you're living in a time before electricity. There's no central heating. There's no electric lights. So like when it came to Lancer, like the roots of mech fiction are like war and power and responsibility. So I wanted to make those words like huge in my campaign. So when I knew I was going to be playing Lancer and I knew all this mech combat would be happening, I was never going to be happy with like, oh, we have to fight, then we do some story, we have to fight, and those two halves being like not connected. I wanted my players to feel like they were fighting, that these fights were heavy and dramatic and unforgettable. So to make my game more melodramatic, I actually took inspiration from a couple of weird pieces of source material, Battlestar Galactica and Formula One documentary Drive to Survive. What I really like in BSG is that the pilots go out and fight, but then come home to essentially an aircraft carrier containing a community. I wanted my players to feel that friction of a community that wanted to celebrate them as conquering heroes, but also where their heroism was non-negotiable and costing them a lot. So I imagined a Dust Bowl planet in some forgotten corner of the Lancer universe. I imagined my players were part of a big nomadic sand crawler of about 1,500 people with some Middle Eastern influence that I used AI art to generate. I know, I'm sorry, I would never use it in my professional career, but it is useful for just throwing down concept art for my players. And I imagine this community had uncovered 3 mechs and could now go and fight to get themselves a better slice of the planet. But the reason this intrigued me is it meant that as my players were fighting, I imagined this whole community that they came from watching through surveillance drones. What I was trying to do here is like, yeah, there's the like tactical survival layer that battles have, but I also wanted like kind of like a sports game or like public relations layer that would change how my players wanted to fight. And then slowly every battle became like a political event, with different members of the players' home community starting to feel like their favorite warrior king mech pilot should rule the community instead of the pre-existing ruler. And then my players were free to decide how they acted as celebrities. Like, were they going to be responsible and be like, I don't think I should be in charge? Are they going to like lunge for power like weird fascists? It ended up being really thought-provoking and gave my players a lot of freedom to decide what direction the story was going in. Also, speaking of what direction the story was going in, I made a little map that is not AI. I pulled it from Google Earth and then used dry erase to like kind of turn the adventure into a bit of a point crawl, to add like a little strategic layer to this war they were fighting, as well as the tactical battles. So where does Drive to Survive come in? Okay, all right. I so love all the scenes in Drive to Survive where you can see the mechanics and the team captains watching their pilots go around in these expensive machines, completely unable to do anything about it. I think the tension in those scenes is so fascinating, in the way that you have like 40, 50, 60 people all working on this mech, and then the whole thing being left down to one driver's ego. I brought all of that to my Lancer campaign. I even had in one battle when one player's mech didn't support another, they came home to the community with each of their respective mechanics teams having a huge brawl. And I loved the intensity of emotion that we all got to explore together. Like, you know, it's one thing for players to love their mech. Of course, they're going to love their mech. It was super cool and fruitful to have them come home to a community of like 500, 1,000, 1,500 people who have not just as much love for the mech, but maybe sometimes more. And maybe they're starting to have confusing feelings about like, do you love me, the pilot, or do you love the robot? Or do you think of me, the pilot, as part of the robot? It's just really juicy stuff to explore. So that was how these fights would end up influencing the role-playing, but it was super cool when the role-playing half of the game would influence the fights. Like, I gave my players an APC full of mechanics that they could call into a battle if they needed some repairs mid-fight, but obviously that APC could get damaged, and if it got blown up, that would be like the defining tragedy of a generation for their community. So my players were wondering like, am I gonna risk bringing the APC on because I would be politically dead when I come back to the community? It's great. I really think making the mechanics and pit crews such a big part of our campaign was a really successful part of Lancer, not just because it like, you know, it's like my kink for seeing mechanics do their thing at top speed, but also because it made the robots feel more like robots. Like when you get your arm blown off in a fight and then come home and you get to see your entire team of like 30 mechanics all go, oh my God, because they know they're not going to be able to sleep for a couple of days. I don't know. Okay, what didn't work in my Lancer campaign? I would encourage you to have a think about how you can make these robots feel big. Because that's another part of the like fantasy of mech fiction, right? That you're in this big robot. Here's the thing, the Lancer combat rules definitely do make you feel like you're fighting with robots, but the Lancer combat rules don't make you feel like you're fighting in a big robot. Like if the Lancer mechs were a tenth of the size, you wouldn't have to change the rules and the game would still function. So, as a GM, you should think about what you can add to your battles to make the robots feel big. One thing I did that worked quite well is having, in some fights, the players fight individual squads of tiny people, and then you can narrate like one revolver shot from a robot, creating a huge crater that kills like 4 people. Super gnarly. I would also think about like, I don't know, having fights where the robots don't have their guns, so they have to like rip up tree trunks and start hitting each other, or have it so that like your players are fighting in a town, so that when they miss a shot, you then roll to see what they blow up. Maybe they blow up a power station or the local pub. Neither me nor my players were really aware we were failing to make these robots feel big until the very last session where we did something kind of... It ended up being my player's favorite fight of the campaign, but we didn't actually use the Lancer Hex combat rules. We used the narrative rules. One of my players basically made a play to be the leader of the community. The other 2 players tried to stop them. And so they had this fight in their robots, climbing in and around the aircraft carrier like, you know, children fighting in their living room. You know, the mechs were pulling themselves up onto, like, because we'd taken this community that we'd been role-playing in for like 8-9 sessions, and then my players got to get in their robots and basically not trash it, but like play with it because they had a very clear mental image in their head. And as they were climbing and up and over their homes, as all the NPCs they knew were like running for their lives, suddenly they felt enormous. And my players were like, oh, this is amazing. And then we realized we had only done that in the final session of our Lancer campaign. So yeah, think about how to make your players feel huge. The other thing that didn't work great in my campaign of Lancer is a bit weird. So we did a session 0 where me and my players decided on the characters. I gave them some robots. We did some world building together. We decided what the community would feel like. That was all great, and we moved into session 1. I failed to bring up something that it turns out was like a big difference between me and my players. I was imagining something like Prestige TV. I was imagining a story where there were no good guys, right? There's just different people with different motivations. My players, or some of my players, felt that because this is a combat game of giant robots, understandably, the action and the story they were telling was a bit more schlocky. And when their community started to treat them like heroes, they went, okay, we're heroes. So towards the end of the campaign, they started conquering towns and defeating the other robot pilots who were trying to stop them. We had some really... The scenes weren't bad, they just felt a little tonally off, where my players would like get the better of a pilot who was defending, an enemy pilot who was defending their community, and just be like, and treat them like a villain. Be like, you won't trouble any more people, bam, punch their head off. And suddenly, as a GM, you're supposed to be a fan of your players, right? But that NPC was not a bad guy, but my players assumed it was, and did something, and just basically brutalized them. And so my players thought they were good guys while acting as bad guys, and the train kind of left the tracks, narratively and ethically speaking, a little bit. So I would say, in a game with killing, especially if you're like me and you want killing to feel real, and you maybe even want to explore themes of like guilt and PTSD, make sure your players know that's what the game is, and if your players don't want to play that game, don't do it. Tellingly, on this subject, I think it's interesting that the first big campaign for Lancer they've released, called No Room for a Wallflower, has players fighting robots. I think because it's a neat way of ducking this whole problem. So that is Lancer. I want to keep all this stuff safe because I imagine looking at it when I'm 80 and experiencing the biggest blast of nostalgia of all time. Finally, let's talk about Heart. I'm actually already experiencing nostalgia just looking at these sheets. Oh, the Heart campaign was so good. I don't have as much to say here because, as you'll remember from my review of Heart, this game is so easy to run. Practically runs itself. Why are the players here? It's up to them. Where are they gonna go? Down. What are they gonna do when they get there? Die. Unlike Lancer and Wildsea, which give you a big open-ended sandbox and then some ideas for you to hang a campaign off, Heart kind of is a campaign by itself. My notes are really straightforward. They're just, like planning out the next location that my players are about to visit. I did do one special thing with Heart, which is like my players had just finished a campaign of Spire, so I had like a MacGuffin that they were following that came from their Spire campaign. It's not important, but if you also end up playing Heart and then play Spire, or Spire then Heart, you too will be unable to resist the clarion call of putting little Easter eggs from one campaign into the next one. Continuity, it's good. But yeah, my campaign of Heart was more or less like every other game of Heart. Fucking awesome. And the idea of giving you tips is like a little silly because frankly, the section in the Heart book that's about running Heart is one of the better sections on GMing that I've ever read. It also includes one of my favorite tips ever, which is when you're inhabiting NPCs, pick a mannerism and go at it hard. Catchphrases are good too. You're aiming for professional wrestler grade characterization. Superb, no notes. So I don't have some grand vision of GMing to sell you on, just do what the book says. I will, however, talk about a few things that stick in my memory from my campaign of Heart. Did something just fly into my hair? It did. I actually want to start by simply praising Annie, one of the players I had at my table who taught me how to be a better player, and I want to tell you how to be a better player in a section I like to call Play Like Annie. So Heart is a weird fractal hell dimension full of like fucked up organic weather and weird flora and fauna, right? 3 of the 4 players at my table saw this, like many players will, as like an obstacle course they had to push through. But a 4th player, Annie, quite literally would stop and smell the roses. If I narrated blood rain, she would stick out her tongue and taste it. If I narrated a weird little bat living in a wet crack, she would try and feed it, and then as it got closer, try and snatch it out of the crack to eat it as a snack. I should add, she was playing a witch, so all of this is kind of on theme. But the reason this was so good is like it didn't slow the game down. These scenes weren't long, but they did take all of these landscapes that we were exploring and make them real. They no longer became like a level in a game, they became an environment that Annie, and by extension the rest of us, were living in. Listen, there's a really good tip in the Mothership GM's Guide that encourages you to talk about smell and touch. And specifically that game talks about it because it's a horror game, right? And when you talk about smell and touch, your players are going to be inhabited in their player character's senses more, which is going to make the situation more tense and scary. But I think it's good advice in any game. If you talk about what something feels like or smells like or tastes like, it just brings a game to life. And usually, as a GM, that's something I have to remember to do, right? And frankly, I don't remember it often enough. But I didn't have to remember with Annie at my table because she would ask. Great. Play like Annie. Smell more stuff. Another thing that went really well in my campaign was this. I am aching for the chance to do it again in another campaign, but I'm gonna have to wait until I can do it again. So instead, I wanna encourage you folks to do it for me. So there's a really nice section in the Heart book that talks about the value of art down here under the ground. It says lots of people who live down here naturally end up creating art because, quote, reason has failed the inhabitants of Heart. Instead, they've turned to rhyme. I got mega inspired by this, so I created a location of my own called the Black Flamingo Gallery, which was like an artist's retreat for people to come down from the city of Spire to get inspired by Heart and make some weird art, and then maybe go home or maybe end up staying here forever. So my players ended up stumbling across this artist retreat, and the artist retreat said, okay, you can stay here, we'll give you room and board, but your characters, with you, have to make a piece of art that we then keep. That's your payment. And this simply rocked. It has entered my GM tip Hall of Fame along with let players roleplay being drunk or high because it lowers their inhibitions, and it doesn't just create funny scenes, it also creates scenes that tend to be really heartfelt and emotional. But letting players make art is awesome. I don't mean literally make art, I mean just get their characters to narrate what art their character would make and how good they are and what they try and express and what medium they use. It is such a cool exercise to situate players in the heads of their character, and all of my players ended up making really vivid, cool stuff. And I'll tell you what else. At the end of that art, I had them all roll skill checks to see how good their art was, and there could not have been more tension around the table if they were fighting to survive an attack from a dragon. Making art is now officially my anime beach episode of an RPG. One final observation I have about Heart, and this is actually a line I cut from my review because it didn't feel super duper relevant and that review was already hella long, is that the locations at the start, near the entrance of Heart, what are called tier 1 locations, they're all like perfect little adventure sites. They're like weird and messed up and small and grody, and the players experience them and move on. But as you get deeper into the Heart, the locations the book offers you kind of resembles a From Software game, right? Where to start, you're like trudging through a nasty little swamp and hitting a skeleton. But then by the end of the game, you're in these like football stadium-sized cathedrals and whole ruined cities and like displaced afterlives. And the whole game takes on a scale that's more like dreamlike and inhuman and grand and abstract. Heart kinda does that too, which is perfect tonally. It feels like what should be at the center of Heart, but it's also less obviously an adventure hook. It's less obviously a fun thing for players to run around and explore. So here's my tip for you. In the final chapter of Heart, as the setting gets more vague and hallucinatory, something happened in my game by accident that I think you should actively encourage. Think about using that emptiness, that vertiginous distance from humanity and civilization as clean, empty space for your players to have inter-party conflict in. Like, tell your players, this is the second to last session, next session is the finale. You are in right now kind of like the waiting room before you all go and die. And when players know that, any like beef they have with each other, any secrets they've kept from each other, your players are gonna realize like, oh, I need to put this out now or I'll never put it out. And they are additionally encouraged to do this if you narrate that they're hiking through huge empty spaces where for once, nothing is bothering them. You see, it makes sense at the start of a Heart campaign that even if the player characters don't like each other, they have to work together to survive these weird settlements and horrible creatures. But by the end of a Heart campaign, your players are going to be crazy powerful. They're going to know they have one session left to live. And what naturally happened in my game is that PvP started to feel like on the table. It didn't happen. My players didn't fight each other, but the fact that they could, like, when you know your character's gonna die anyway, like, suddenly the idea of, like, maybe going out fighting another player is not so crazy. Like, maybe that's as appealing as going out fighting the villain. And, like, I can't state this enough, that didn't happen in my campaign. I'm not saying you should have players fighting each other, but it gives what is already a really tense and exciting finale of a campaign, like, a real buzz. Like, we could fight each other. I could, in the words of Grant Howitt, regurgitate a tactical nuke and kill us both. And that's just a really interesting place for a story to be in. Or, like, I keep fishing for different ways to express this. Don't think of these like final locations in Heart as weirdly empty. Think of them as spacious because the player characters should be taking up so much space. Whew. Thank you very much for watching, everybody. If you've enjoyed this video, or if you think it was missing a little something, if there was something you want to hear about in my campaigns that wasn't in this, do please let me know in the comments, because I'm thinking of turning this into a regular feature. It makes sense, right? Like, every 3-4 reviews I do on Quinn's Quest, I do a big Patreon roundup video where I talk about how my campaigns actually went and what I learned from running them. Take care, folks, and congratulations on surviving at least, 15-20 minutes of my very questionable handwriting.